Hey everyone, so it's not exactly a week later, probably more about 6 months later, but I had a few things going on. As you can see, my setup has changed a little bit. We ended up moving houses, so that was an inhibitor, and I also had a lot of work going on. But I did want to start back and let you know that I am going to be changing things up a little bit. Instead of me trying to research more like bash basics, I'm gonna be kind of trying to just include what I do for work in the first place. So from now on, I'm gonna be mainly using things that I've either created already for work or a little bit that are a little bit more practical for essentially using bash from a pen testing perspective or just a automation of Linux perspective. So just different cool commands that well, at least I think are cool, that I've come up with is what I'm going to be doing from now on. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into this week's lesson. So we're going to be using Nmap to help sanitize our IP addresses. So just as before, we've got the prerequisites, and then we've got the video if you want to follow that, and then I've got written instructions. The program we're going to be using today is Nmap, which along with bash to kind of help bash and grep and talk. So normal standard Unix utilities, as well as Nmap, which is more of a third-party tool. So the reason why we would want to do this is if we are given a CSV or a text file from a client, sometimes what they'll end up doing is having some type of text which might end up getting and interfering with the actual data that we want to pull back from that file. And so I'm not going to be going super into detail as to how you can grab that data, but because I have a command on my blog, and my blog explains everything from that command, so I'm not going to be going super in detail to that. But essentially, we want to automate grabbing IP addresses out of files, and then once we grab the IP addresses out of files, we want to make sure that we're excluding or sanitizing the IP ranges that the client gives us. So that's just a few different examples as to why you want to use Nmap to essentially sanitize the IP addresses that you're going to be attacking or doing an engagement with. So there are other ways that you could do this. You could write a script to parse it yourself and then feed in files for excluding different things. I think there was actually a Python script that internally Secure Ideas had written that tried to do that. But since Nmap already has all the functionality, I'm a lazy/efficient sysadmin, so I'm going to only use whatever I need. And so if I don't have to rely on an extra script, or I don't have to create an extra script, I'm just going to use what's there. So Nmap has all of that functionality that we'll be able to use, and let's go ahead and dive in. So I'm going to have this snapped over here and this over here. As you can see, I'm already inside of the bash tricks environment with the VM that I SSH'd into. My host name is going to be a little bit different than yours because I'm on a different hypervisor, but everything is going to work exactly the same because it's just a plain old Ubuntu box. So I'm not going to talk super in detail about these aliases, or what an alias is, because we actually did that in a previous section, which I've got an alias refresher down here in case you are unaware of what an alias is. But what we can do really quick is this is the link to my blog where it explains what the actual command does with this explain shell link, and then this specifically is the one that we're creating aliases for, so that way we don't have to type out the big long commands every single time. I'm going to be copy pasting anyways, but since this is more of a tutorial on actually using Nmap to filter things out, I didn't want to have to essentially display the output that I want you to see in a weird way, so that way, because there's so much space taken up by the actual commands themselves. So we're just creating aliases for those. And then that's not what I want. So next we're going to cd into this week's lesson, because we're actually got a few different files in here that we're going to be using for examples. One of them is the example IPs. So here's an example of where 192.168.1.0/24, this is Bobby's home, and then the .2.0/24, this is where we drop off the tables, as in Bobby tables. So we are going to use our alias to grep out we're going to use both of the aliases to grep out the specific IP addresses from that file. And so just to kind of show you what's happening behind the scenes here, we're going to use set -x, and if you need a primer on the set or environment, we've got that here as well. So you can go back to that whenever if you want to know more about these commands, or that command that I just did. Essentially, it's going to display more verbose output as commands get executed. So you can see that we are grepping out the specific individual IP addresses here from the example IPs file, and then we're using the sort command to sort all the different IP addresses. And like I said, I'm not going to explain that because I've got a link on explain shell for that, or on my blog to explain shell for that. So now we're going to undo the set that we did, so that way we don't continue to get verbose output. But that's just an example of how you can see what's going on in those aliases. Sorry, 1 second. I'm not used to talking this much, so I need some water. So now we're going to output that into a file called example.ips. So now if we do a cat on example.ips, you can see we've only got the specific IP addresses with their CIDRs. Oh, that's one thing I didn't cover. This grep grabs either IP addresses, either individual IP addresses or IPs and their CIDR. So it can do both. Just to quickly go over that. So now we're going to go inside of the Docker container. And should be launching. There it goes. Sorry, for some reason that took a while. So now we've got some more aliases. The sort IPU we've already talked about above. The get nmap results, we're gonna slowly build up to what these do. And then this is just an alias that puts the two of them together. Again, don't want to have to format my commands in a specific way so it's easier for you to read. So this is just going to cut down on how many things are going to be displayed on the screen. So again, you can always do the set -x for showing more verbose or debugging information, essentially. So as you can see, we've got all the different aliases in our environment now. These look a little bit different from whenever we pasted it, but you can just ignore that. So now we're going to, I'd hit Control L to clear the screen. We're going to add Nmap to our Docker container. And we're going to cd into our this week's folder inside of the Docker container. So now we're going to start starting to build up to how we're going to grab the specific IP addresses from the nmap command. Specifically, this command is taking in input from the examples.ip file, and then the SL is essentially listing out all of the different IP addresses from the scan, and then the tac-in is not to resolve. So the SL flag is actually why we're able to use this, because what it'll do is it'll list out all the IPs and it won't actually scan anything on the network. So instead of us actually accidentally scanning or waiting for a scan to come back, we're not even touching the network at all, and we're getting all of the different IP addresses back from what it would have scanned. So you can see that by just doing a head to get the top 10 results. The unfortunate thing we're going to have to deal with is dealing with removing this, because all we want are the lines with the actual IP addresses on it. And if you do a tail, there's actually a footer as well that we're going to have to try and avoid. So to avoid that, we're going to just trim off both of them by only looking for lines that have the word report in it, because neither of those lines have report in it. So we're going to scan, or we're going to use Nmap to list out all of the IPs, and then we're going to grab all of the different IPs lines with the grep reports. So as you can see, we've got all the different IPs now, and now we don't have a footer and we don't have a header. You can do a head on that if you want, but kind of just have to trust me, unless you want to check. So now we only want the IP addresses. So what we're going to do is we're only going to grab the 5th field here. So awk is a tool that's kind of used to modify, it's used for string manipulation. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're just going to take the 5th field here, and the reason why I was able to identify it was the 5th field is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're going to print the 5th field, which is the $5. And so now we go ahead and run that command, and we're only getting back the IP addresses. So if you want to explore the data IP addresses a little bit more, you can just run this command. And from now on, we're going to start using the aliases. So here's just a quick usage of the aliases, so that way you can see it's the same results. So now we're going to be using the together now alias, so that way we're using them together and we don't have to pipe the aliases like how we were doing before. That just combines them. So you can see still getting just the IP addresses back. And the exact amount of IP addresses is 512. So now we're going to start doing that initial sanitizing of those IP addresses. Now we're listing out all the IP addresses that we have been given by the client. Yep. And then I was just making sure that I had explained or made sure that you were able to see what the IP address ranges were, and I already did that, so that's why I froze for a second there. So we've got 2 different files in here. One of them is exclude IPs, and one of them is exclude IP01. So we're just going to be messing around with the first one initially. So you can do exclude IPs. And you can see that this is taking the range format that Nmap accepts. So now we've used CIDR and we've used the range. And the last one, exclude IP01, is the individual IP address format. So now we've cycled through all the different various formats that Nmap accepts from files. So that just shows you how versatile you can list out different IP ranges and do different things to help easily filter out the actual IP addresses. So now we are going to do our sanitization. So if we do this, it's going to go ahead and do the same command we were doing before, same exact thing. And then this is the extra flag that we added on, which is exclude file. And so that's going to tell Nmap, hey, exclude anything that you find from this file in our IP address range. So we're going to grep out, or we're going to do the normal together now alias to go ahead and only get IP addresses, and we're going to count the lines, which I forgot to explain. WC is word count, but there's a specific flag you can pass it for tac L, and that is to count each line instead of the words. So we're going to go ahead and run that. And as you can see, before we had 512, and now we have 419. So do some quick math here in bash, and that's 17. So now it's important for you to know that the IPs that get listed out here in the exclude IPs range, those are inclusive to what are listed out. So that means that 192.168.1.10 all the way to .20 are excluded. So that's a total of 11 IP addresses, not just 10, because it's inclusive as to including 10. So it's not just like 11, 12 up to 20, it's 10, 11, 12. And you can validate that with the command we were running before, but now we're just going to run it on the exclude IPs. And so you can see that's 17. And so, for example, yep, so 17 total, because this is 11 and then this is 6. So again, 17 total. And it's inclusive. Remember that. If you list any type of IP address in that file, it's going to be included in the exclusion range. So, lastly, I wanted to show you that the exclude file flag doesn't allow you to continuously add more files to it. It essentially takes whatever the last file is that you pass for the exclude file flag, and it doesn't tell you that it's not taking the other one. So you can see the result from this is 511, which means that it only removed one IP address from the range that was initially getting outputted. And that's because the exclude files exclude IP01 only has one IP address. So a hacky way that you can get around this is, and I say hacky because I wouldn't recommend doing this. I would recommend just putting all of the excluded IPs into one file. You can use that grep command if you've got text and stuff, but I would definitely recommend putting all of them into just one file and then just passing that one exclude file flag to Nmap. Because this is, while it works, it's not more official. So now, whenever we run it like this, I'll explain what's happening in a second. We get 18 IPs that are excluded. So you could just do that instead of, I'm improvising and I normally don't, but I just thought of another demonstration. So now you can see instead of 495, we're doing 494. So what's happening here is we're using the subshell execution section of, or functionality of bash. And so that's what these brackets are doing. Sorry, one second. These brackets are the subshell execution. The star is using the glob functionality of bash, so it's grabbing all of the files that start with exclude underscore, and since all of our files are exclude underscore IPs and exclude underscores IPs 01, it's going to grab both of them. And so you can see the subshell, and we're catting both of those files, and the output from this subshell is getting fed into a file that's getting temporarily created, and then that file is getting fed with this parameter into the command. So you can see that by if we ls whenever we get that file back. So that's feeding, this is a special subshell that feeds into the command. Instead of feeding the input, it feeds the actual file name. So to show you that it's actually combining the different files, we can do this, and as you can see, it's got all of the IP addresses instead of the individual groupings of IP addresses from those files. So that's everything that I had. The last thing was the one caveat with my grep command is that it requires Perl regex, which is supported in most versions of Bash, especially the ones that are used in Linux. But for example, on OS X or Macs, and then Alpine, they actually don't support the TAC-P flag. Instead, they support the TAC-E flag, which is the extended regex. And my regex for this command will not work for extended regex. Perl is a little bit more simplistic, but as an alternative, there's actually a Twitter thread that you can use some of the other pen testers that I talked about some of this stuff. I think it was actually, who was it? Jason Lang was the actual one that started this, and I ended up adding to it, but he was explaining his grepping of IP addresses grep command, and so I ended up adding my stuff down here. This was wrong, so I ended up correcting it down here. But if you need to use the TAC-E flag, which again most Linux distributions are going to use or support the TAC-P flag, then you're going to want to check out this tweet and copy that over and use that instead. But you can just replace that with the IP grep here, and all of the commands will run perfectly fine. So I wanted to go ahead and wrap up and say, if you guys, or if you all have any ideas for different commands that you want me to explain or go through, or things that you think are cool, feel free to tweet at me or DM me or whatever you want to do to get in contact with me. I've even got my email on the website for secure ideas, so feel free to send me a message however you want, and I will definitely try and go through whatever you provide. So, alright, well, have a good day. Take care.